Did Jesus make a promise to return quickly and then fail to keep it? Over the last few centuries, this has become a common accusation, and this passage in Matthew, more than any other, has formed the crux of the debate. Jesus has just sent the 12 out on a preaching mission. He warns them of the dangers that await them on the road, and then he says this: "When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next, for truly I say to you, you will not complete the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes." What did Jesus mean when he said the disciples would not complete the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes? Is this not the sure evidence that Jesus was supposed to return very quickly and failed to do so? So how did Matthew understand this saying of Jesus? What does it mean for the Son of Man to come before they complete the cities of Israel? Well, the first perspective is simply that it refers to Jesus catching up with the disciples on the road. He sends them out to preach, and before they're done, he's going to catch up with them, right? That it's very mundane, that it's not very dramatic, it's not the end of the world. And there's some sayings about the coming of the Son of Man that back this up. For example, there's one that says the Son of Man came eating and drinking. Another one says the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Every saying about the coming of the Son of Man isn't necessarily about the end of the world. There's some logic to that. And it would make a lot of sense to see it this way, because Matthew would know in his time that the gospel's spreading all over the world. This is some kind of coming of the Son of Man that is very local, that is not so dramatic. Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, before Jesus says this to them, in 9:35, Jesus is just preaching in Galilee. In 11:1, he's still just preaching in Galilee. So in between, when he sends them out, just preaching in Galilee and says, you're not going to finish before the coming of the Son of Man, he might just mean him coming in a very mundane sense and catching up with them on the road. And this would help, because there are other sayings about the coming of the Son of Man that clearly are the second coming, according to those who hold this perspective. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So Matthew understands that the gospel has to go to all the nations before the end comes. So whatever the coming of the Son of Man is here in chapter 10, it can't be the end, right? It must be a very mundane coming of the Son of Man. Also, Matthew understands that the end of the world, the glorious second coming of Jesus, that this isn't going to happen quickly, that it's delayed. He says 3 times in chapter 24 and 25 that the Master is delayed. And so this coming of the Son of Man must refer to a different event. Also, Jesus says regarding the second coming that he doesn't know the day or the hour. Well, in Matthew 10, he says it's going to happen before you guys are finished in your preaching mission. So again, Matthew must understand these two comings to be different things. One of them is the second coming, but the one in chapter 10 isn't. And Witherington makes a point here. He says, notice that the saying says nothing about the Son of Man coming on clouds or in glory or with angels. The coming could be a perfectly mundane one. The resolution really could be this simple, that like the Son of Man coming, eating and drinking, like the Son of Man coming not to be served but to serve, he's just coming to catch up with them on the road. No big deal, way too much controversy over nothing. Now, this could be the way to resolve this, but I doubt it. There are some significant problems with this view. Namely, leading up to this coming of the Son of Man, it claims that the disciples will face imprisonment and martyrdom by governors and kings. Well, read the 4 Gospels. Nothing like this happens to the disciples before Jesus goes to the cross and before his resurrection. So it would be strange to limit all of this to Jesus catching up with them on the road, because there's certainly no kind of drama like this. This kind of assumes a developed Christian faith that is, gotten around and irritated some powers and some authorities before it gets to this scale. Wenham says it's only necessary to recall Jesus' own experience to see that appearances before kings and Gentiles do not necessarily mean removal from the Palestinian area. He's missing the point entirely. It's not just about them being removed from the Palestinian area. It's about the Gospels not ever telling us that they suffered martyrdom and imprisonments to such an extent. And if one of the 12 suffered martyrdom, well, then who replaced them? You know, it's just a very odd way to read it. And finally, lack of profundity. The one who endures to the end shall be saved. Well, when Jesus comes in this passage, there's some kind of salvation for the disciples. In this word for being saved, it doesn't always have to be, you know, the final salvation at the end of the age. It can mean physical deliverance, such as physical deliverance from illness. In this context, it clearly refers to being rescued from persecution. Well, the disciples were not rescued from persecution once Jesus caught up with them on the road. In fact, most of their persecution was still in the future. So ultimately, while this kind of reductionistic perspective has some good qualities, I think it has to be rejected. The second perspective is that of the resurrection and the ascension. Now, this has some advantages that the first perspective has, but less of the problems. For example, the resurrection and the ascension would have taken place before the gospel spread throughout all the land of Israel. So temporally speaking, it happens soon enough. It also relieves conflict with passages asserting the delay of the parousia or Jesus' ignorance of the parousia, again, making a distinction between this coming and the coming discussed elsewhere at the end of history can be helpful. And it does not reduce the language of profundity. I mean, Jesus is talking like this coming of the Son of Man is going to be such a big deal. Well, if it's just him catching up with them on the road, well, that seems pretty mundane. But the resurrection and his ascension to enthronement at the right hand of the Father, well, that would be profound enough. The second perspective, which is especially associated with Karl Barth, is based on the allusion to Daniel 7. All this language about the Son of Man coming on the clouds, this comes from Daniel chapter 7. And it's interesting when we read this, it's not about the Son of Man coming to the earth, and therefore it couldn't be the second coming. It's about the Son of Man going to heaven. And of course, this is what Jesus does after his resurrection when he ascends to heaven. I'll read the text. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days. That is, the Son of Man just went to heaven, and he went to God, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. So two things happened here. The Son of Man went to heaven, and he received his authority over all the world. As we'll see here in a moment, that's what happens to Jesus after his resurrection. And so this would be a corrective to Christians who think that the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven is obviously about the second coming, and also, of course, a corrective to their counterparts, to skeptics who say, well, then why didn't this happen in the first century? Why didn't Jesus come back? It might not be about that at all once we take seriously the allusion to Daniel chapter 7. Now, Karl Barth paid a lot of attention to the verses following verse 23. A lot of expositors don't do that when trying to figure out what's going on here with the coming of the Son of Man. And basically, this is just a passage that says that disciples are participating with Jesus. If Jesus is going to suffer, they're going to suffer too. And he took this element of participation to the next level. He thought that there was an aspect of participating in the geographic span of Jesus' mission. So when we look ahead to the resurrection story in Matthew 28, we see something very interesting in contrast to what has happened earlier in the gospel. Earlier in the gospel, Jesus says he is sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and then he tells his disciples that they are sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he states that this will come to an end whenever the Son of Man comes. Well, as we've seen, that happens at the ascension. Well, when Jesus appears to his disciples at the end of the gospel, In the resurrection, he claims that this has happened, that he's already been enthroned, that he has all authority on heaven and earth. So now that Jesus is not locally contained to Israel, but he has authority over all the nations, what does he do in the very next verse? He sends his disciples to all the nations. And so the coming of the Son of Man gives the Messiah global authority, and so now it gives the disciples a global mission. And thus we should understand that the coming of the Son of Man was effected at the time of the resurrection and the ascension. Now this perspective has some interesting features, but it has some problems as well. Like the first perspective, it seems to assume that persecutions and martyrdom took place before the coming of the Son of Man, which according to Barth and his ilk would be the resurrection. Again, the Gospels don't record that. Disciples are not on mission when the Son of Man comes. This is at least a little bit awkward because according to Matthew chapter 10, whenever the disciples are persecuted in one city, they'll flee to another city, and this is what happens until the Son of Man comes. Well, at the time of the resurrection, they're not on mission at all. They're not going city to city. They're just in Jerusalem, and they're not on mission at all. They're just hiding. And so the description of the disciples at the time of the resurrection does not match Jesus' description of what the disciples would be doing when the Son of Man comes. And finally, the one who endures until the end shall be saved. In context, this salvation is not just, ultimate soteriological salvation. It's salvation from persecution. And when we read the book of Acts or any of the other Christian documents, we can see that they were not rescued from persecution at the time of the resurrection. In fact, this is when you get an uptick in persecution, because this is when they go out and they begin to proclaim Jesus. So this is a very interesting perspective, but I think ultimately it fails. Then we have the third perspective, that this is a reference to 70 AD, to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now this has, the advantages of the last perspective. Daniel says the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds is going up, not coming down. And those who hold to the 70 AD perspective, they share this boon. If you've ever read much of N.T. Wright, you know he talks a lot about vindication. And that is, in the Daniel text, the Son of Man doesn't just go on the clouds of heaven and get enthroned in the heavenly realm. There's also judgment on the beasts who have persecuted him, on the authorities who have made him suffer. Daniel 7:26, but the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away. That is a reference to the beast, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And so there must be not only the enthronement of the Son of Man, but the destruction of his enemies. Well, it is the temple complex that puts him to death. And so the vindication that Daniel speaks of would be a reference to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, N.T. Wright will take the coming of the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 10 as the same as the coming of the Son of Man elsewhere. So in chapter 16, where he says there be some here who will not taste death until the Son of Man comes, well, this would make sense because some of those people would have still been alive in 70 AD. Elsewhere, where he says this generation shall not pass away before the Son of Man comes, again, it's 40 years. It's within a generation that the temple is destroyed. And so you have a number of strengths here. It happens early enough that perhaps all the towns and cities in Israel have not had a chance to respond to the gospel. It also gets the direction right on the Messiah riding the clouds into heaven. And there's this element of vindication that the enemies of the Messiah are destroyed. Now, just looking at one of these passages very briefly, notice it says, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. It doesn't simply say the Son of Man, it says there will be the sign of the Son of Man. And then it begins to talk about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Well, if we're looking for a sign of the Son of Man, then we're not just looking for the Son of Man himself. In other words, those who subscribe to this perspective say when the temple is destroyed, that is the sign of the Son of Man. We weren't supposed to be looking for the Son of Man himself to be coming in the clouds. We were supposed to be looking for the sign that he has gone on the clouds and been enthroned in heaven and been vindicated over his enemies. When his enemies are destroyed in Jerusalem, that is the sign of his enthronement. Now, D.A. Carson does not share Wright's perspective in the sense that all the coming of the Son of Man passages have to be about 70 A.D. Some of them can be, and then some of them can be about other things. Nevertheless, when Jesus promises that they will not complete the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes, D.A. Carson also believes this is about 70 A.D. He says in the post-Pentecost period, during a time when many of Jesus' disciples are still bound up with the synagogue, that is the key. Right? Because when Jesus lists off the persecutions that they will suffer before the coming of the Son of Man, one of them is that they will be whipped in the synagogues. Well, that doesn't happen much after 70 A.D. So the whippings in the synagogues must be climaxing with the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. This perspective has strengths, but it also has problems. No explicit mention of Jerusalem's or temple's destruction in context. In the other Son of Man sayings, there are lots of references to the destruction of Jerusalem. But that does not happen here in chapter 10, and so it's very difficult to pin this coming of the Son of Man saying on the destruction of the temple. In this statement, the one who endures until the end shall be saved. Were the disciples saved from persecution at 70 A.D.? It does not seem to be the case. I'm going to try to show you that at 70 A.D. there is an uptick in the church's sufferings. There is no salvation from the church's sufferings. We begin with the flight to Pella, which is in Jordan. I just read, a chapter contribution from Lee Levine in Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, and lots of other historians who take this very seriously, that there is historical substance to the tradition that Christians fled from Israel when the Roman armies were coming in 70 A.D. And it makes sense that if they did so, that if they didn't stay and fight the Romans, that this would further distinguish Jewish from Christian identities, something that had not been completely distinguished in 70 A.D. Well, it's now going to become distinct very quickly. And as Christians are increasingly recognized as not being actual Jews, they, of course, are going to face more resistance from their Jewish neighbors. Synagogue expulsions in John's Gospel. If we accept John's Gospel as being written in the 80s or the 90s, which is when it's usually thought to have been written, there are a number of places where he seems to highlight people being thrown out of the synagogue. For example, in chapter 9, a blind man is healed, and his parents don't want to give straightforward answers to the Jewish authorities because they don't want to be put out of the synagogue. In chapter 12, many of the authorities believed in Jesus, but for fear of the Pharisees, they didn't confess it because they didn't want to be put out of the synagogue. And for a long time, expositors on John's Gospel have thought that the reason John focuses so much on people being put out of the synagogue in his story is because it resonates with what is happening in his day, that Christians are being put out of the synagogue. And thus, after 70 A.D., in the 80s and 90s, there is no relief from persecution for those Christians who still had or desired to have some attachment to the synagogue. Things are getting worse. Then you have the 18th benediction, which is actually involves a curse on heretics. Now we're looking at a version here that comes from Cairo in Egypt, which explicitly mentions the Nazarene. I have that highlighted on the screen. Now, the earlier versions, which go back to the 1st century, may not have explicitly mentioned the Christians. There's a lot of debate among scholars as to whether or not this curse on heretics always included a reference to the Christians. Some, such as Shea Cohen, who's Jewish, and he's going to say no, Jews were not cursing Christians as early as the 1st century in their liturgy. Other scholars, such as James Dunn, says, yeah, I think they were. So there's a lot of discussion here, but most likely, I think, the cursed groups would have included the Christians. Certainly the other groups that are being cursed in this prayer are very similar to Christians in some regards. For example, those who compiled the Book of Enoch, who believe that God's deity is extended through an angel called Metatron, those who compiled the Targumim, who believe that God's word, his Memra, is a kind of lesser Yahweh. These groups had theologies similar to Christians who had deified Jesus. And so we see a formal curse against Christians likely coming in the years after 70 AD. Then we have the Fiscus Judaicus. This is a tax applied by Domitian in the mid-80s to punish Jews for their failed revolt. It was applied both to Jews and, according to Suetonius, to those who lived like Jews. Now, this precipitated another tipping point, according to James Dunn, distinguishing Christian and Jewish identities. Now, Nerva in the year 96 reforms the law in such a way that it would clearly distinguish Jews from other groups, including Christians. But this leads to the persecution of the church a few years later under the Emperor Trajan, because Christianity, so long as it was recognized as a sect of Judaism, was protected by Roman law. But once there is a clear break in Jewish and Christian identities, well, now Christianity is an illegal religion and can be formally persecuted by the empire, as it surely was in the days of Trajan. And then finally, you have the synagogue of Satan references in the book of Revelation. Those who've worked on that book suggest that it is under the Emperor Domitian in the 90s, where you have this huge issue that we can see in the pagan sources as well, that there's too many informants. Domitian has a system in place where people can anonymously inform on their neighbors and get their neighbors in all sorts of trouble. And it appears that Jewish informants are really making trouble for the church in Asia Minor when the book of Revelation is written. Now, we can't have a perfect historical reconstruction of the church between, 70 and 100 AD, but these are some of our best lines of evidence, and they all suggest that the church was coming under more and more persecution, that things were getting worse. They had not been saved from persecution by the events in 70 AD. In fact, 70 AD begins to really distinguish Jewish and Christian identities, making Christianity all the more obnoxious to Rome because it wasn't a legal religion. Things get harder for the church at 70 AD, not better, and therefore I don't think that the 70 AD perspective can be counted as any kind of salvation, and thus it must be rejected. The parousia, that it does in fact refer to the second coming. I think this is the right perspective. It easily accommodates the reference to Gentile persecutions and martyrdoms. The promised salvation, we don't have to worry about that. If it's the second coming, obviously there would be a salvation from persecution. And it's interesting, Matthew never narrates the return of the 12 like the other Gospels do. And this could be a hint that he considers this mission to Israel to be ongoing for the duration of the church age. In his article on this text, Meyer shows a good reason to think that the coming of the Son of Man should be defined as the second coming, not one of these other things, the resurrection or 70 AD, because there is a parallelism in Matthew chapter 10. These 12 Jesus sent out corresponds to verse 16, where Jesus says he's sending them out. In verses 11 through 14, he tells them about the inevitability of rejection. Same thing, verses 16 through 23, the inevitability of persecution. And in verse 15, when the first panel culminates, truly, truly, I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment. This is held in parallel with, you have not have finished the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So the Son of Man coming is held in parallel with the day of judgment. And if that is the case, then of course we need the parousia, we need the second coming to explain this language of the coming of the Son of Man. Now at this juncture, we need to stop and talk about what it means to complete the cities of Israel, because this is taken in different ways. Up to this point, we've been assuming it's this second option, that you will not have finished proclaiming in the cities of Israel. That is, before they proclaim in all the cities, Jesus will have already come back. This is a possible way to take teleo, but teleo can be used in other ways as well. The first option, you will not have exhausted the cities of Israel. That is, exhausted them as cities of refuge. Because he says, when they persecute you in one city, flee to the next city, for you will not have completed, or you will not have exhausted the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. In other words, there's always going to be persecution, but when it happens in this city, you can flee to another city. There's always going to be a city of refuge. You will not have used up the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. This is possible, and in fact, this is very popular in literature. A lot of good scholars like Scott McKnight hold to this perspective. And then there's the third perspective. You will not have finished evangelizing the cities of Israel. That is, it's not just about proclaiming, it's about completing an evangelization mission, whether partly, completely, substantially, however far God intends. There's this expectation among certain expositors throughout history that the Jews would respond favorably to the gospel in the end time. And he's saying this mission will not be completed before the Son of Man comes. Now, when we look at teleo in terms of what it can possibly mean, I don't take very seriously this notion that it could mean to exhaust the cities as cities of refuge. That makes really, really good sense contextually because of the verse before verse 23. But when we just look at what this word means throughout the New Testament, it never means to exhaust a resource. That place where you can see on the graph where it's green, where the ESV has it translated as gone, that's actually how they translate, Matthew 10:23. You will not have gone through the cities of Israel. But that's probably not a good translation because it's the only place where that could possibly work. Here's examples from the Septuagint and then arguments from Sense on the bottom. And I just have a difficult time taking this to mean exhaust a resource, to exhaust these cities of refuge, when the word typically does not mean that. It usually means to complete a task or to arrive at the conclusion of a period of time. Now we need to talk about the best way to translate this, because it's probably not a matter of Jesus hurrying up and returning. It's probably a matter of contingency based on the grammar. In other words, should we say, you will not have completed the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes, or you will not have completed the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes? These are two very different things. If I say, you will not be able to fix the car before I come home, then you fixing the car and me coming home are totally independent exercises. It's just that one is going to happen so fast that it cuts off the other. That's how people have been reading this. But if I say that you will not be able to complete the mechanical job until I show up with the right tools, that's very different. What I'm saying is not that I'm going to come so quickly, but that your mission is not complete until I show up with the right tools, permitting you to complete the mission. Now, a number of scholars working on this text point to Daniel Wallace's treatment of the grammar here. He says, quote, the subjunctive is frequently used after a temporal adverb or improper preposition, meaning until. And he gives eos and archi and mechri as examples. Or after the temporal conjunction otan with the meaning whenever. It indicates a future contingency from the perspective of the time of the main verb. Now, what does this mean for our passage? Now I'm going to give you some examples of how this works with the subjunctive following temporal adverbs or temporal conjunctions. For example, blessed are you when they revile you. Being reviled is the contingency for being blessed. You have to be reviled in order to be blessed in this construction. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you pay the last cent. In order to be released from debtor's jail, you have to pay what you owe. That is the condition for being released. A more controversial example, blindness in part has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. In other words, before the blindness can be removed from Israel, the full number of Gentiles has to come in. So if we apply this grammar of contingency to our passage, we're not going to go with, you will not have completed the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. We're going to go with, you will not have completed the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. Right? There's a contingency element. It's not that you tell your kids that you're not going to be able to finish the dishes before I come home and interrupt the process. That's different grammar. The grammar here says, after you finish the dishes, you better do the refrigerator, and after you do the refrigerator, you better clean the bathroom, because the mission to clean this house is going on until I come back. Right? You don't stop working until I come back. And in context, this is what Jesus has done. He has been emphasizing perseverance, that the one who continues until the end shall be saved. Right? You can't cop out on the mission early. The mission is ongoing until the second coming of Jesus, because at the second coming of Jesus, that is what will conclude the mission. This is not about haste. This is about endurance. The second coming of Jesus is the contingency for the completion of the mission. It doesn't interrupt the mission. And that's what has been missing from so much of this controversy. People did not understand the Greek grammar before they made their conclusions. There is no temporal element here, in other words. There is no rush. There is no haste. Now, why is it that the second coming of Jesus completes the mission? Why is that the terminus point? Is there anything more that comes from this? Well, I think there is. Whenever we take this and compare it to another passage, which is very similar, and that has this same grammar, this grammar of contingency. In chapter 23 and verse 39, Jesus has been rejected by Jerusalem. And he says, "For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Now, throughout church history, and several modern scholars as well, this has been understood as Jesus saying that Jerusalem will embrace him. They will repent and accept the gospel before the second coming. And scholars no less than John Nolan says, despite all the difficulties and all the hostility, the Matthean church expected a significant Jewish turning to Christ. Allison and Davies, verse 39 is best understood not as a pronouncement of condemnation, but instead as a promise of redemption. The Messiah will come when his people repent. Now, taking a step back and looking at this a little more closely, it looks like these are two aspects of Israel's redemption. One deals with Jerusalem in particular, and the other one deals with the cities in general. In chapter 10, the cities of Israel persecute and kill the disciples. In chapter 23, it's Jerusalem in particular that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. And this culminates with the coming of the Son of Man in 23, which completes the mission to the cities of Israel. Well, in the other text, Jerusalem blesses the name of Jesus at the time of the second coming. Both of these texts stem from the hope of Matthew and his community that in the face of Jewish obstinacy and resistance, that still one day before the second coming, Israel will embrace the Messiah. So these passages should be read as mutually informing, and both of them pointing to the second coming, not as something that will happen really fast, but as something that will bring about Jewish repentance. Now, before we conclude, I just need to point out that taking this passage as a failed promise is on very shaky ground. Because when we look at the possible meanings for the coming of the Son of Man, and look at the possible meanings for teleo, to complete the cities of Israel, there are multiple possibilities. And whatever conclusion you come up with, you should be very tentative about it. There are a lot of scholars who present options on this passage, and then they just say, I don't know. I'm going to be humble and tell you I don't know. And likewise, I want to tell you that even the conclusions I've come up with here are very tentative. I'm not really sure. It's just this seems to be the most probable explanation for where I am right now. But when a person says, well, Jesus is talking about the second coming, and he's saying that he would come before the gospel spreads throughout Israel, they're selecting option 4 with option 2, which is very shaky, right? It's not the first best option. It's not even the second or the third best option. But to just act like the meaning of this text is so obvious and it's just a broken promise, well, that's someone who has not, I think, read much literature on this topic. They're not familiar with the intricacies and the difficulties of this text, and they're ultimately just saying the thing that they want to say, because nobody can come to this passage and walk away from it feeling confident. It's just too complicated. And therefore, if you're going to say this is a failed promise, then please walk me line by line through all these things that we've discussed in this video, because I doubt that once you do, you're going to be able to confidently assert the thing that you've been asserting.